Hello and welcome back to Paleocast. My name's Dave Marshall and this is episode 115 on the diatoms of Lake Baikal. A while back we had a listener request for us to speak to Professor Anson Mackay of University College London. I can't remember exactly who requested this, as I think it got buried under a whole load of comments or messages, but you know who you are, and so make sure you claim credit for this episode in the comments, as it was a great suggestion. So this is a two-part interview, and it covers a huge amount of ground. At its core, we're looking at the diatoms preserved in the sediment of a single Siberian lake over the past several thousand years. But from that, there is so much that you can tell about the world. In this first part of the interview, we put everything into context. How lakes are host to incredible sedimentary records, how important diatoms are ecologically, and also what kinds of information can be locked away in their fossils. In the next episode, we'll take a closer look at Lake Baikal itself, and what its diatoms tell us about its history and the world in general. So, apologies for the delay in getting an episode out, but it is the start of the academic term and, well, it's 2020, so it's been a fairly difficult time to arrange interviews. But we hope you're all doing well, and a special shout out goes to all of those students starting term in what must be incredibly difficult circumstances. As always, images following this episode are available on our website, and we'd love for you to like, share, subscribe, rate, and anything you can do on social media to help get us seen. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, and thank you for joining us today. That's your bit.
All right, okay. I thought you were talking to an audience. Hello, thank you for having me.
With every single one of our interviewees, we want to know about them. What was your route into paleontology? Just tell us about yourself.
Okay, so I'm actually an ecologist, botanist by training. But my route into paleontology was really from my dissertation during my undergraduate days at Edinburgh University. And there I was introduced into paleoecology and using fossil pollen to reconstruct past vegetation. And I was kind of like really kind of sort of fascinated how you could take a number of different sort of paleo studies and you could put them all together to build a sort of a regional synthesis. And for me, it just kind of like something I could sort of reconstruct the history of landscapes and past forests across southern Scotland. And for me, that was quite a bit of a game changer in how I approached my whole degree, actually, and what I could find out. So that was kind of the undergraduate days doing that. And then I was really lucky to secure a NERC-funded PhD. And this is to look at factors that caused upland blanket peat erosion in the UK from both a climate and human perspective. And even before I knew what I was doing, I was doing like what's called a multi-proxy study, although I didn't know that word at the time. And that meant I could use like fossil pollen. I could look at fossil charcoal to look at burning patterns. I could look at heavy metal analysis in peat cores going back in time to reconstruct pollution. And I could put all these things together to understand, the long-term perspectives on upland ecology and conservation, etc. And I guess we would now look at that in the context of what we now call the Anthropocene, but way back in the early 1990s, we hadn't sort of conceived of that word yet. So really, it was about looking at sort of fossil pollen. I think was my main introduction to paleontology, first of all.
Yeah, so that's all really recent stuff. So is there a cutoff point where you'd say, okay, this is paleontology or this is just environmental science? Is it a continuum? Would you even separate the two?
I guess for me, I kind of associate sort of paleontology really with maybe more on sort of longer geological timescales. So say pre-human history. But I think that's one of the brilliant ways that sort of academia works at the moment, and especially when we consider things like sort of earth sciences or we consider something like geography. It's such an interdisciplinary topic that really, it, it can be recent and it can be far back in the past. But even to understand things far back in the past in geological timescales, we need to understand recent processes as to how that, the taphonomy of the fossil that we're looking at, how did it actually come to be preserved? And that needs kind of modern day work. So really, I kind of see the two as being highly interlinked, and it's probably just, a jargon definition that might separate whether it's from earth sciences or from geography, a department that I'm more familiar with.
Okay, and if we go back in time now, we're going to talk to your 18-year-old self. We're going to say, Anson, don't go into academia. It's not worth the trouble. What would you do with your life if you weren't an academic?
Well, that's sort of it's uh, in some questions it's quite hard. It's quite a hard one to answer because I've come through the route of doing sort of undergraduate, PhD, postdoc, and then into lectures. So in some senses, unfortunately, I've known nothing else. But I have thought about it, and a job that's come up in my head quite frequently, even from doing a PhD, postdoc, and then lecture, and even quite recently, was actually being a detective. Um,
Oh,
and because and I mean this seriously, because in some ways it's mainly the sort of same principles. I want to understand a mystery. I need to critically assess the evidence. um, I need to understand motivation and biases behind the evidence that I'm collecting, the skills that I need, etc. Um, so yeah, so I have actually looked up eligibility of joining, say, the Met Police before, and I've just done it again, like recently as well, thinking, what can I do the last 15 years of my working life, and I think I'm still eligible actually. So yeah, that's all very good.
well, some people might be surprised by that, but I think in episode something like 70, we did one on coccoliths.
Okay.
And we spoke to someone from Network Stratigraphic, um, Liam Gallagher,
Uh huh.
and he helped solve a murder case. It was the Ian Huntley murders,
Oh wow.
and that was
Okay.
partly solved on paleontological evidence that linked him to the crime scene. And that
Okay.
was on, yeah, just the presence of these coccolith fossils that couldn't have come from anywhere else other than the crime scene,
Oh wow, cool.
unless he had been in France, which
Wow,
he
cool.
hadn't. So there, it linked him there. So there can be a nice link with fossil pollen, with microfossils, nanofossils. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, certainly. I actually did one of my courses in my degree was on forensic science. Um, and that kind of like fed in a wee bit into, like you said, like you can use pollen to see, pinpoint sort of where they were in the landscape, or use diatoms to see whether they were, was there, when they were in the water, did they go in the water dead or did they drown in the water type stuff? And you can use diatoms and lungs to determine that. So certainly you can use microfossils in a number of different ways in forensic. So yeah, so that'd be another kind of addition, I guess, to uh, the, the the detective bit of my life.
Okay, so we're leaving the ITV crime dramas behind, and we are instead focusing on lakes. Why lakes?
um, so lakes for me sort of became important because when I've been looking at sort of landscape change, sort of realizing that landscape change is all about the freshwater part as well as the terrestrial part. And within the freshwater part with lakes, you can look at the lake's sediment record and then you can reconstruct back in time. And so I think it's true to say that my interest in lakes kind of really came from the potential to do paleontological work rather than lakes themselves per se. Although, the more that you get into a subject, you understand the importance and context of the actual ecosystem that you're working with. Um, and 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 then for me, from my PhD into my postdoc was actually working in. I think I'll come on to talk about this lake a bit later, working on Lake Baikal in Siberia, and so I was kind of like thrown in at the deep end, both literally and figuratively, since it's the deepest lake in the world. I had the opportunity to study this amazing place, and so my kind of sort of love for lakes really stemmed from working on Baikal in the first place.
So would you say that they're definitely more than just big puddles? They're not kind of transient, like just accumulations of water, but they are incredibly significant, would you say?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, lakes are really incredibly important ecosystems. And if you take kind of sort of lakes and rivers together, because they are kind of connected, these are the, sort of, this is the surface fresh water that's available for drinking, for which billions of people rely on. Um, Um, and although sort of surface fresh waters, lakes and rivers only cover about 3% of the Earth's surface, they contain like about I think it's like just under 10% of all animal diversity, and one third of all vertebrates, and 40% of global fish diversity. So really, they punch well above their weight in terms of what they mean for how the Earth regulates itself in terms of biodiversity. Um, but I would say that for lakes and rivers, they are under incredible environmental threats. We have the what I would call the enemies of old, things like exploitation and pollution from agriculture, from sewage, which is as bad as it ever was many decades ago. Um, and also we have sort of new threats from emergent contaminants such as personal care products, plastics and microplastics, etc. And so lakes are important because if you have poor water quality, then we have a decline in freshwater security, both for drinking, for use by humans, but also other flora, fauna, etc. And these are, a healthy lake means healthy biodiversity, and lakes play an incredibly important role in, geocycling of different elements on the earth, such as carbon, silicon, etc. Again, there's a link into paleontology. They're important for understanding how the Earth processes have changed over time. Now you mentioned sort of transient, and I think maybe for a geologist or our scientist, um, it's probably true to say that most lakes in the world have kind of formed in the northern hemisphere since the start of the last ice age. But of course, lakes come and go over longer timescales. And some of the lakes that I'm more familiar with working in, such as Baikal, are what we call ancient lakes, and they've been around for millions, tens of millions of years, and are very, I would say, a permanent feature of the landscape. And so in that instance, depending on what you're interested in, lakes can cover, I think, most aspects of that.
So I want to get an indication of the kind of information that lakes hold and also how long they hold it for. So you've mentioned the different organisms there, you've mentioned uh, pollution, and I suppose that links into chemistry. So what can we learn from lakes?
Okay, so from a paleontology perspective, um, lakes build up. Within lakes, we have a buildup of lake mud or lake sediments. And this forms our what I would call a natural archive. And the deeper in the lake mud or lake sediment you go back further in time. And there are a bunch of natural archives. You have tree rings of natural archives, ice cores, marine sediments, lake sediments, etc. Um, and they all have their strengths and weaknesses. And I would say that one of the big strengths about lake sediments as a natural archive for reconstructing past environments is that lakes are found virtually everywhere in the world at some point in history. Um, and in that respect, so we can look at lakes that are still existing today, or we can look at paleo lakes that may have existed millions of years ago, but we can still find the old lake beds and the old lake sediment records. So we can still do environmental reconstructions. Um, so in that case, we can reconstruct environment anywhere in the world. In terms of, say, let's look at the resolution. Um, uh, Many lakes form these annual bands, which means that we can reconstruct past climate at an annual resolution going back thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. And that's incredibly high resolution. And if we're talking about, say, we're looking at global warming today, and global warming is, I would say, an abrupt period of climate change that's happening very fast. We can look in the past to periods when we had other periods of abrupt climate change to act as an analog to say what's happening today. And with lake sediments, we can do that by looking at abrupt periods of climate that have happened at an annual scale, and that kind of that rivals, say, the ice cores or tree rings in terms of resolution, and that's incredibly important because we may find lakes where tree rings are trees aren't growing, for example, so we can build up a more holistic picture of the Earth as to what's happening from looking at these different archives. So that's the actual archive. Um, we can also look to what's actually preserved in the archive. I think this is what's important from a paleontological perspective. So we can look at fossilized organisms, and usually this is the remains of a whole organism. So it's bits of organism that are left behind. So things like a very common one is pollen, which is coming from vegetation, and different types of trees and plants produce different shaped pollen, and we can reconstruct past vegetation looking at that. Um, we can reconstruct past chemistry from lake sediments. We can even go down to individual elements or compounds to reconstruct past productivity. We can reconstruct sort of past concentrations of carbon in the atmosphere, etc. So there's a whole range of things we can look to lake sediments in terms of whatever our paleontological question is. So really, lakes are incredibly important for whatever kind of hypothesis we want to address for a particular scientific question.
And so all of this information is stored in layers under the lake water. So how do you actually physically get it?
That's the fun part. um, so a lot of our work. So um, there are two main ways. So when we want to investigate a lake that sort of still exists today, we have to obviously navigate how do we get the lake mud out from through the water, and in this case, we do a lot of field work in that respect. So we would have a team of people. It could be quite a small team. It could be like, say, 2 to 4 people. We would go out in one or two kind of inflatable boats, for example. We would sort of make a rig, so we would sort of stabilize a couple of boats together. That would give us a platform, and from that we would have what's called a lake sediment coring device, which we can lower down into the water through, for example, its own gravity, its own weight, and that will then, with a plastic tube in the end, and that will go into the lake sediment, and then we kind of like we do a couple of actions, and then we can pull the lake mud out contained within the perspex tube out to the top, collect it on the boat, seal it up, and then cut it in slices. I've also worked in, for example, so I've mentioned that I've worked on Lake Baikal, and that's the deepest lake in the world. The lake water depths up to 1,600 meters, and there we've actually worked on a ship. So you take the ship out. You have again, it's the same kind of sort of coring principle. In this case, we had a ton of steel. That was the weight that drove the corer down to the water into the lake sediment, and then we had this metal casing, and we pulled it back up again, and that contained our lake sediment record. So again, depending on the type of lake we want to go to, we may have sort of slightly different techniques.
It sounds like you would have many a field trip anecdote
Uh,
if we were to go to the pub.
yeah, yeah. I mean, there are quite a few, and especially sort of working out in places like Russia, for example, in Siberia, you meet sort of different types of people, you meet different types of cultures, etc., different ways of working, and that's always quite challenging and very fun to navigate those aspects of undertaking a scientific endeavor with different groups of people who may work differently, but we all have the same common goal, and that is to obtain sort of scientific results.
And with Lake Baikal, you say it's the deepest lake in the world. It sounds like those sediments are going to be fairly well protected from being disrupted by human activity or whatever. Are there certain lakes where all of these sediments have been churned up, maybe by, I don't know, drag net fishing or whatever you call it? Are sediments ever lost or disrupted?
Yeah, so one of the things that actually I quite like about doing so in my field, looking at lakes in the past is called paleolimnology, and that's especially utilizing using lake sediments. And one of the things that I quite like doing is always assessing the quality of the record that you have. So we may make this big assumption that when we collect the lake mud, I'd like as you just said, it's all intact, but often it might not be. And there could be a number of reasons for that. So, for example, some lakes that exist in a semi-arid region, some lakes may dry out sometimes. And if they dry out, that means that the lake mud can be blown away by the wind, and then the lake might infill again. And so you need to assess whether you've lost some sediments through this kind of what's called a deflation process. Um, Other places you may have bioturbation. That's where like sort of small organisms or like fish, for example, may disturb the very top surface layers of lake sediments. So taking that into account can be quite challenging sometimes. You may have human activity. So dredging of lakes can be a problem, especially in areas we've got high sediment accumulation rates and the lake is actually infilling. So in places like in southern England, reservoirs, etc., they may be frequently dredged, and so there the lake sediment record is obviously is not very good.
Okay.
And again, I was going to just finish off. And again, in Lake Baikal, although it's in southern Siberia, it's also one of the most the region is intensely affected by earthquakes. And there, if you've got an earthquake, it's not just the land that's shaking; the whole lake is shaking as well, and the sides of the lake are shaking. And there, you may have the sediment record maybe disrupted by what we call like mass flows and things. So there are a number of different ways that the sediment archive can be altered by different processes, and I actually find it quite good fun trying to work out, okay, so is our sediment record intact, or are there problems with it, and can we like to take account of these problems?
One extra bonus question that I've just come up with in the middle of this interview that you've not been prepped upon.
Cool.
I'm sure you'll be able to answer it. But are lakes and the information that they contain very endemic? Can you compare one lake with another? So if you were looking at the fossils in one lake, did that just one kind of fossil live in one kind of lake, or do you get similar things between lakes that you can compare easily?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So you can do both. Okay, so one way that we can bring lakes together. So for example, we may be looking at say we take Europe, and when we're looking at the impacts of industrial pollution and freshwater acidification, lake sediment records were incredibly important for proving that lake acidification was caused by the Industrial Revolution, because we could reconstruct pollution back through time from the lake sediment records. But we could also look at fossilized diatoms, these one-celled algae. And because in Europe, diatoms are not really endemic, they're quite cosmopolitan. That means the same species are found in different places throughout Europe. We could compare these changes, whether we're in Northern Europe or Central Europe or Southern Europe, and we can make we could assess continental level of changes in acidity just by looking at the diatoms and the lake sediments. However, if you go to somewhere like Lake Baikal, where most of the diatom species there are what we call endemic, that is, they've evolved there, especially just in that lake. They're found nowhere else apart from just in that lake. Some of the inferences that we can take from looking at the sediment record are only really relevant to Lake Baikal itself. But given its importance as a global lake, it does have, we can place this lake into a global perspective. But again, depending on the questions we want to address, there may be only sort of local answers, or there may be sort of regional to continental answers. So, interesting question.
Before we get into our paleontological case study, can you give us some insights into what a typical lake is as an ecosystem?
Yeah, so lakes can be, or we most usually think of lakes as being freshwater ecosystems, but they can also be brackish or saline as well. Um, and I like to think about lakes as not just the lake by itself, but also I think we should think about lakes and its connection with the landscape as well. So it's the rivers that flow into the lake. It might be the river that may flow out of the lake and into the ocean, and it may also include the atmosphere above the lake as well. Because certainly when we're considering what's in the sedimentary record will contain evidence of what's happening in the catchment, it will contain evidence of what's happening in the atmosphere above the lake itself, and it will contain evidence of what's happening within the lake. And so in terms of lake as an ecosystem, it's incredibly important. Say, for example, from an ecosystem services perspective, an ecosystem an ecosystem services where we get some kind of humanity gets some kind of benefit from the lake. So obviously lakes are incredibly important because they provide fresh water for humanity to exist. They provide protein in the forms of fish and other food for food for humans, and they can be have aesthetic and cultural values as well. Lakes are really important in terms of ecosystem function as well. And it's increasingly recognized that lakes play a very important part of the global carbon cycle. It used to be thought that lakes were just, sort of, say the forests were important for global carbon, and then the oceans were. And the lakes just acted as a conduit between carbon going from the land into the oceans. But now we kind of recognize that lakes themselves, the sediment record, stores carbon over tens of thousands, in some cases millions of years, and therefore they're essentially sort of extracting carbon from the atmosphere, and so lakes play a very important regulatory role in the carbon cycle. They also play important roles in the phosphorus cycle, the silicon cycle, nitrogen cycle as well. And so in terms of how lakes exist on the planet, they are really incredibly important ecosystems.
So, what are some of the organisms that we would get in there? What is their biodiversity like?
As I mentioned briefly before, lakes hold a disproportionate amount of biodiversity in terms of animals, vertebrates, and especially fish. But I'm kind of more interested in, say, the microorganisms that live in lakes. Um, and so lakes are really important for in terms of like algae, for example. We can have algae, blue-green algae. They're very important for water quality. They can be very toxic to humans and other animals. But yeah, algae are important for when they sink to the bottom of the lake. So algae photosynthesize. They're plants. Um, and when they sink to the bottom of the lake, they can preserve in the lake sediment. And so from that, we can reconstruct, what's happening in terms of these, what we would call primary producers. And of course, primary producers are important for other organisms, important, say, for the zooplankton that live in a lake, and then the zooplankton are important, say, for fish that live in a lake. And so then the whole kind of the food web are all kind of obviously interconnected. Um, and One of the great things about lakes is that we can, from the lake sediment records, we can look at say fossilized algae such as diatoms, which have this glass shell, and we'll talk about in a wee bit. We can look at chemical compounds in lake sediments, and we can do that to reconstruct other types of algae that don't preserve. We can reconstruct things like the zooplankton, such as Daphnia, other things called Cladocera, and they all leave behind bits of remains of their exoskeleton. And all these things they're all in the insect family. They're all like in the arthropods. So these remains contain, sort of chitin. So that's why they're preserved. We can even look at the fish scales, which may preserve in lake sediments as well. And so, in some senses, we can use lake sediments to reconstruct the whole ecosystem of a lake. And then, if you build on that, the pollen that comes from the catchment, or even say charcoal that comes from burning the catchment, we can then sort of look what's happening with the freshwater ecosystem and look at that in relation to the terrestrial ecosystem, or from looking at fossils and lake sediments. And so the thing that I really am fascinated in is we can use all these things together to look at how basically the whole planet in some ways is changing in different in different regions in a very holistic manner.
It sounds like you can get such a diverse range of information from lakes. And so, with that wonderful overview that you've just given us, let's now just concentrate on one single source of information, the diatoms. Can you give us an introduction to this group?
Okay, so diatoms they're plants. Okay, so they photosynthesize, and that means that they they produce the energy that's needed for the rest of the lake ecosystem to basically survive. Okay, and although diatoms are only one group of algae in lakes that are important for doing this, um, they're kind of unique because diatoms they've evolved to have this silicon shell, and the silicon shell it's a bit like a glass shell. It's made of this thing called compound called biogenic silica, um, and this allows diatoms to preserve in lake sediments in lake sediments, and that's why we can see sort of diatoms, we can use them to reconstruct past environments going back at tens of millions of years, going back to the Jurassic, for example. And the other feature that sort of makes diatoms really useful in terms of paleontology is that this glass shell, it has evolved really intricate patterns, and a large part of diatom analysis is identifying diatoms down to the species or even the subspecies level. And this is, it used to only be based on their morphological remains. So we may have like round diatoms, we may have pointy diatoms, we have star-shaped diatoms, and all of these have this kind of like very intricate patterns on their glass shell that we allow them to identify the species level. But now we can use genetic analysis, and that's increasingly being used to kind of maybe to get a more fine tuning on the different diatom species that may have lived, back through times. So yeah, so diatoms are incredibly important. So not just as primary producers, but because they're one-celled organisms, they're also very sensitive to the environment as well. And so different diatom species will grow in a lake depending on, say, your lake is acid or neutral or alkaline. Some diatoms prefer to grow in lakes that are nutrient rich, and some prefer to grow in lakes that are very nutrient poor. Sidon diatoms can grow in lakes that are very exist in cold conditions, like in the Arctic, where some diatoms can tolerate very warm waters. Um, and so by looking at the different types of species that we have, when we find those fossils going back through time, we can therefore make a reconstruction about the environment, about what the Earth might have been like based on those fossilized diatoms, because they have these very particular environmental preferences.
Some species have more than one different type of test, this delicious skeleton. So, could you tell us about some of the resting spores?
Most of the work on diatoms is actually done from the vegetative cells that we find. Some older diatoms, like evolutionary older diatoms, have evolved uh, resting spores. And these resting spores are important because they allow diatoms to tolerate periods that are quite harsh for them to live through. And these resting spores are often the spores are even more highly silicified than normal. And so that allows them to survive a period of harsh conditions. Um, or it may allow them to survive, as we'll find out for somewhere like Lake Baikal, which is so deep that because diatoms contain this glass shell, they're actually quite heavy. But because they're plants, they need to photosynthesize. And so there's always this tension between trying to remain in the surface water where light can penetrate so they can photosynthesize and survive, to having this glass shell, which provides an evolutionary perspective advantages because, for example, a glass shell is not, it makes them less palatable to organisms that may eat them, for example. Um, but that glass shell comes at an environmental cost and it makes it heavy, and so diatoms always sink through the water column. And if they sink too far, then they go outside of where the light can penetrate, and that means they can no longer photosynthesize, and that means that they could die. So some diatoms actually produced a resting spore, which means that they can sink out into the dark for an extended period of time. But then eventually, the way the lakes work, that they may get brought back up to the surface of the lake water, maybe sort of many months, maybe many years later, and that means they can then restart the life cycle again. So so the spore formation is not as important maybe as in some other organisms, but certainly for some species, spore formation is an evolutionary advantage that has been kept on.
Is there any information contained with that silicious shell of a diatom in, say, its chemistry?
It's not just the species themselves that can give us environmental information, um, but because the diatom shell, and each one diatom cell actually has these two halves of shells that cover it. And within these shells, and sometimes they're called valves, sometimes they're called frustules. So I'll probably call them frustules here. Um, Within these frustules, we can also look at the chemistry of the biogenic silica. Um, and so we can look at things like stable isotopes, such as the stable isotope of oxygen or the stable isotope of silicon within the diatoms. And that can tell us a lot about how productivity or how even climate has changed in a lake, because these isotopes, the diatoms take them up from the lake water as the diatom is growing, and so the diatoms are really reflecting the environmental status of the lake water at the time the diatom was alive. And so from that we can reconstruct paleoproductivity, we can reconstruct past climate as well, just from looking at the chemistry of the frustules as well. So really diatoms have multiple uses, which is just why they're just fantastic organisms to work on.
Can you concisely summarize the stable isotopes? Why, for instance, the isotopes of oxygen can tell you about the environment?
Okay, so say we take something like oxygen, consists mainly of oxygen, what we call oxygen 16, but it also contains heavier isotopes such as oxygen 18. And when we're looking, and they're always in different proportions, and that can be affected by different aspects of the hydrological cycle, for example. So when we look at something like in a lake that receives more of its water from melting snow or glaciers, then those waters will contain a different amount of proportion of oxygen 18 to 16. And so by looking at the proportions of these isotopes, we can then make inferences about what past hydrological conditions were like. And the same we can do for a silicon as well. And so as diatoms take up silica to make their silica shell, they also change the proportion of silicon isotopes in their valves. And if they do that faster at some point, at some time, say we've got in a warmer environment, then that will change the ratio of the silicon isotope. So again, by understanding contemporary processes that affect these isotopic compositions in the present day, when we find these compositions back in the past, again we can make these environmental inferences.
Okay, so let's finally focus on Lake Baikal and do a little case study. So a lot of your work has focused on it. You've told us that it's an ancient lake, the deepest in the world, and it's in Siberia. Is there anything else we need to know about it? Paleocast was brought to you by Dave Marshall and Liz Martin Silverstone, with contributions from Tom Fletcher, Vish Venkat, and Elsa Pancharoli. Music was composed by Patrick Kendall Smith. Paleocast was made possible by funding from the Paleontological Society and the Paleontological Association, but the show now relies on funding from you, the listeners. So, if you've liked this episode, please consider donating, and thanks to everyone that's helped out so far. Please visit paleocast.com for the supplementary material to this episode and for our archive of past programs, and follow us across social media platforms to get all the latest news. Finally, if you enjoy our podcast, then please explore all of our video content on YouTube and follow our other projects, the Virtual Natural History Museum and the Paleocast Gaming Network.